This is Laura Fleming, Political Science 201, Lecture 8 on political parties. Here's a little thought question to get us warmed up here. Think about American history, whatever you know, your favorite presidents who are no longer with us. And do you remember whether they were Republican or Democrat? Do you remember their political party? Many people can identify presidents like Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, Lyndon Johnson, LBJ. They are both Democrats. Presidents like Ronald Reagan and the first George Bush, they're both Republicans. Can you go back a little further? Can you identify the very first Republican president? We'll talk about that. Actually, some people are surprised to find out the very first Republican president was none other than Abraham Lincoln. What about the first Democrat president? Well, the first Democrat president was someone named Andrew Jackson. You may have heard of him. If you click on this link in the PowerPoint, okay, there's actually a country western song by Johnny Horton about the Battle of New Orleans featuring Andrew Jackson. Okay, very interesting little song, the Battle of New Orleans. So I want to read, I like to add a little color from time to time. I want to read you a little vignette about Andrew Jackson, the very first Democrat president. This is from Paul Johnson's book, A History of the American People. So Andrew Jackson, he was a hero from the Revolutionary War. Okay, so he was in the Revolutionary War when he was only like 13. He used to run mail and things like that. He was kind of a pugnacious guy. He was married to a cougar before cougars were a thing. Okay, so he had this older wife, may or may not have been divorced from her previous husband. And so he would go through various little towns and people inevitably would say something about his wife, something a little insulting. And Jackson, in the manner of the time, this was the early 1800s, he would challenge them to a duel. Okay, so he was always getting into duels, defending the honor of his older wife. That's where I pick up this little vignette. The duels left Jackson's body a wreck. Tall and thin, 6'1", weighing 145 pounds, his body crowned by an upstanding thatch of bright red hair. So he was a ginger, okay, stereotypically, and pugnacious. Jackson had a drawn, pain-lined face from which blue eyes blazed furiously. His frame was chipped and scarred by the marks of a violent frontier existence. One of the bullets from one of his duels broke two of Jackson's ribs, buried itself in his chest, carrying bits of cloth with it, could never be extracted, and caused a lung abscess, which caused him pain for decades. In one of his other duels, he was hit in the shoulder, barely saved his arm, and again the ball could not be prized out, remaining embedded in the bone and provoking osteomyelitis. In 1825, Jackson, who was accident-prone, stumbled on a staircase, ripped the wound open, caused massive bleeding, from which he nearly died, and which recurred occasionally all the rest of his life. On top of these hideous scars and bits of metal in his anatomy, Jackson had endemic malaria compounded by dysentery contracted on campaign. So the real winner of the Battle of New Orleans actually was the mosquitoes. So Jackson and his army crawling through the swamps of southern Louisiana got chronic malaria. Also dysentery. He took a lot of home remedies for these, sugar of lead, both externally and internally, a horrifyingly drastic remedy, and also huge doses of calomel, which rotted his teeth. The book goes on. Jackson met these misfortunes with stoicism, even heroism. He also gave his arm to have blood let from it. Okay, this is another home remedy. Jackson's acceptance of pain deepened his resolution, but left further scars on his psyche and intensified his rages. His unforgettably fierce but frail figure thus became an embodiment of angry will, working for America's grand but ruthless purposes. Okay, so that's just a little color to our picture of the first Democrat president, Andrew Jackson. Today we're going to talk about the development of political parties. We're going to talk about our two-party system. Why do we only have two parties? We're going to talk a little bit about the history of U.S. political parties, because we didn't always have the Republicans and the Democrats. So there were other predecessor political parties that we'll talk about. Talk a little bit about the current Democrat platform, as well as the current Republican platform. Okay, so, and again, for purposes of this lecture, you can be a Democrat, you can be a Republican. My goal for you is to understand what that means and be able to choose your political affiliation wisely. Okay, let's start with what is a political party. Political party is not part of the government. Okay, so a political party is a private organization that seeks to win elections and control government power. So political parties have a huge impact on government, but they are not actually government organizations. They are private organizations. So here we see this triangle. It kind of goes through the various relationships that make up political parties. At the bottom, we have the link between the citizens and the office holders. Okay, so this is something that we know from the Constitution, that we live in a republic where we're given the ability to vote and to choose our leaders. Okay, and so we have this link with our politicians. We're the ones who vote for the politicians, and then the hope is that the politicians will respond when we have a particular view or public policy desire. Okay, so we have this automatic link between the citizens and politicians in a republic where we have voting. Okay, so how does the party fit in? So up here is the party organization. There is a relationship between the party and ordinary citizens like you and me. Okay, so we can volunteer for a political party. We can do fundraising, make phone calls. There's all kind of work that you can do for the Republican Party or the Democrat Party, and they're always happy to have volunteers and members, and especially donors. Okay, so what does the party do for us? Well, the party can disseminate information, help get the voters educated, help get out the vote, etc. So we have this, relationship between the Democrat Party, the Republican Party, and the voters. Now, this is something that's very interesting, which is the relationship between the parties and the politicians. Okay, so even though the voters vote for politicians, the party has a large influence. Okay, so we'll talk about the fact that the parties can give money to election campaigns. They can endorse or support particular candidates, and these candidates, when they get into office, they're expected to toe the party line. Okay, they're expected to act and vote for legislation in line with what the party leadership wants. So ideally, the views and wishes of the voters and the views and wishes of the political party would be more or less in parallel, but that does not always happen. Sometimes politicians are caught between what they think the voters want and what these powerful political parties want. Stuck between a rock and hard place, and they have to choose. Okay, are they going to go with the official program of their party, or are they going to break ranks and do what they think their voters want them to do? And that's a difficult choice because these party organizations are very powerful and they can actually make or break an election. Again, although political parties are very powerful, they are not mentioned in the Constitution. So politics in the United States is dominated by these two political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. We know that they vie to control the House, the Senate, and the presidency. So for example, today, House of Representatives controlled by the Democrats, the Senate is controlled by the Republicans, and the presidency currently is Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a Republican, and we're coming up with another election, end of 2020, to decide who will be the next president. Will we have another 4 years of Donald Trump, or will a Democrat, Joe Biden, become president? And the nation seems split in two, so the nation is actually very delicately balanced between Republicans and Democrats if you look at it. And the question is, is this the only system? The United States has something called single member districts, which favor the development of a two-party system. What this means is that we vote for one candidate at a time. Okay, one candidate at a time. With single member districts, the one candidate with the most votes wins. So for example, even though Louisiana has 2 senators, we don't vote for both senators at the same time. Elections are staggered. We vote for one Senate seat at a time. Even though Louisiana has 6 members of the House of Representatives, we do not vote for all 6. We only vote for the one representative that's from our district. Okay, so we're only voting for one person for each seat. And the one candidate with the most votes wins that seat. This system favors the 2 largest parties because no one wants to, quote unquote, waste their vote on smaller parties. Now, we do have some smaller parties in the United States, but they're very, very small. The Green Party, the Communist Party, right? Probably the best known of these small parties would be the Libertarian Party. Libertarians did put up a presidential candidate in 2016. His name was Gary Johnson. If you click on this link here, you'll see a campaign ad by Gary Johnson. And Gary Johnson basically admits that in a two-party system, very difficult for a minority party to break in. He has a funny ad where he talks about how terrible Trump is, how terrible Hillary is. You can vote for him. They have something called the balanced rebellion, right? So through the magic of the internet, if you're a Republican that's unhappy with Trump or a Democrat that's unhappy with Hillary, Gary Johnson promised he would match you up with someone from the opposite party so that you wouldn't, quote unquote, waste your vote. But of course, we know didn't happen. I think he maybe won a very small percentage of the popular vote. Okay, so in a system like this, no one wants to waste their vote on smaller parties. So let's look at a very simple example. Let's say that you do have 3 parties, blue, red, and green, and there's only one seat. So in this example, the blue party has a majority of votes, 50%. Let's say the red party has 1/3 of the votes. The green party has 1/6 of the votes. Okay, very easy math. The district has 1 seat. Candidate blue wins, the other parties lose. And if you're green, you're thinking, wow, it's, I have to beat out both red and blue. Probably not going to happen. So maybe I should just, if I like red, maybe I should align myself with red and we'll have a better chance of defeating blue together. Or, you know, if I don't like red, maybe I'll align myself with blue and I'll have a better chance of actually having my voice heard. Okay, so in this one seat, one candidate, single member district, it really does favor, you know, kind of a close competition between two parties. That's not the only way to do it. Okay, so we're going to look at another example called proportional representation. The European Union, for example, has proportional representation with multiple members per district. So this is a picture of the European Parliament. It has kind of a rainbow of different parties. European United Left, Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats, the Greens, the Alliance of Liberals, etc. You know, 8 or so different political parties. How they do that? Well, you don't vote for one candidate at a time. You actually vote for a slate of candidates, and these candidates can be ranked or unranked. Okay, so voters generally vote by party, and then the parties receive seats in proportion to the vote. So let's say that you have 6 slots available. Each party will put up 6 people for the 6 slots, and then depending on what percentage of the vote the party gets, they'll get to move that far down their roster to fill in the slots. Okay, let's take a look at our example one more time. This time, instead of just voting for one seat, we're voting for all 6 seats. And we have the same split in votes. So blue has 50% of the vote, red has a third, green has 1/6. In this example, if the district has 6 seats, blue party may win 3 seats, red party 2 seats, green party 1 seat. So in this case, the green party does not have to align with red or blue before the election, right? They have the ability to elect at least one representative, but when they actually get into Parliament, you know, then it's a little tricky because no one party has the majority and you have to form various coalitions afterward. Okay, so you get a lot more chaos after the election, you know, when you have this proportional representation with many smaller parties. So this is just to prove that there's another way of doing it, but you know, in our system is established by the Constitution, unlikely to change, so it's likely that we'll probably continue to have 2 major parties. Let's take a look at Federalist 10. That's in your Accessible Federalist starting on page 4. Here, Madison is talking about the problem of factions, and I'm looking at page 4. He says, by faction, I mean a group of citizens, whether or not they add up to a majority, united and driven by particular interests or passions that are opposed either to the rights of other citizens or to the long-term and common interests of the community. So what he is referring to is groups or associations that are trying to gain political power, whose interests may or may not be aligned with the interests of the broader community. And we refer to these kind of groups as interest groups. We'll get more into that, but the largest and most obvious factions, the largest and most obvious private associations that are aimed at gaining political power are political parties. And Madison says, everywhere in the world and throughout history, the problem of factions has proven to be the downfall of governments based on the people. So in other words, if you have some kind of dictatorship or monarchy or government that's not based on the people, where people don't have the right to vote, you don't have to worry about political parties, okay? There is only one political party, the party of the ruler. But anytime you have a government that's has a Democratic or Republican form, then you're going to have this problem of factions, this problem of parties and associations that try to get power. And Madison says, it's true, widespread political participation leads to instability, injustice, and confusion in government. These have been the mortal diseases under which governments based on the people have generally perished, and they provide the enemies of liberty with easy ammunition for their argument. So he says that representative governments, governments with widespread popular participation, tend to devolve into factions, and that causes instability, injustice, and confusion because you have these different groups that are always fighting for their interests rather than for one common good. So what do you do about factions? Can you just pass a law that says we're not going to allow political parties, we're not going to allow interest groups? And Madison says no, that, you know, you can't deny people freedom, right? So he says suppressing individual liberty would be worse than simply allowing factions to flourish. Okay, so the reason we have these factions is because people are free. They have freedom of association. They have freedom to petition the government to redress their grievances under the Bill of Rights. And because of this freedom, they have the ability to form these different interest groups, political parties, and factions. And Madison says we can't just outlaw that. Factions need liberty for their existence, just as fire needs air. And it would be just as ridiculous to eliminate liberty for the sake of preventing faction as it would be to eliminate air for the sake of preventing fire. Okay, so California has lots of wildfires that cause a lot of damage. But we don't go into Southern California and say, oh, let's pump all the oxygen out of the air. That will take care of the wildfire. Well, it would, but it would take care of all life as well. And he also says, we should expect factions because it's impossible to give everyone the same opinions, passions, and interests. As long as people are free to think for themselves and capable of making mistakes in their thinking, they will form different opinions. So we can't expect everyone to have the same opinions. And he says differences in property ownership and therefore differences in interests will necessarily exist in a free society. So the causes of faction are simply a part of human nature. The tendency is so strong, people will often find the most meaningless or superficial excuses to argue and fight with each other. So he says, people are going to have different interests. That's part of human nature. And because we're a free country, people are going to form factions. So what do we do about this? We can't control the causes of faction. Perhaps we can control the effects of faction. So Madison says elections are helpful. He says the small number of citizens elected by the people might be wiser and more dedicated to the common good than the average citizen. This would give them the ability to filter and broaden the views of their constituents. Okay, so Madison sees a value in elections. He feels like the people who are elected to be our leaders are perhaps more likely to look out for the common good, more likely to have wisdom and nobility of interest such that they won't be beholden to one particular faction or another. So I think Madison is very optimistic that way. And then second, he says we have a large territory. And he says, when you have a large population, a large territory, there will be a greater variety of interests present in society. And the more interests are present, the less likely it will be a majority will form around a single interest opposed to the rights of a minority. So Madison says, he feels confident. We're a great big country. We have a lot of different interests, and perhaps all these different interests will balance each other out, and it'll be more unlikely that one interest or faction will gain too much political power. Okay, so Madison didn't like factions and interest groups. He felt like they were a necessary evil, a function of a free society. People are going to have different opinions. They're going to combine into different groups and associations aimed at gaining political power. Nothing we can do about that. But Madison says, we have a good form of government where hopefully elections will refine our leaders and help them to listen to the needs of the country as a whole, and also the fact that we're such a great big country, maybe there'll be so many different interest groups that no one group will have too much power. Okay, so again, very optimistic by Madison. So he warned against factions as a review, called them the downfall of governments based on the people, leading to mortal diseases like instability, injustice, and confusion. You can't outlaw faction without destroying freedom, but he believed in a large country, the many different factions will balance each other, and the election process will, knock on wood, hopefully select representatives wiser and more dedicated to the common good than the average citizen. So again, Madison knew this is a problem. There's going to be interest groups, political parties trying to seize power, but he has some confidence that everything will come out okay in the wash. George Washington. Let's take a look at our first president, George Washington. He also condemned factions in his farewell speech. Okay, poor George Washington, he didn't really want to be president at the end of the Revolutionary War. He was burned out. He would rather just go home. But the people wanted him to be president, and Washington became president knowing that he had the ability to bring leadership to the very young country at the time. Okay, so he served his best during his first term. He didn't really want to run for a second term, but he was worried that these early divisions, even in his own cabinet, would break apart the country. So Washington served for a second term. By the end of the second term, he was done. Okay, so he gave this farewell speech, despite which his own cabinet broke into the first two political parties. We'll talk about this. But I'm reading from George Washington's farewell address after his second term as president. He says, all combinations and associations under whatever plausible character with the real design to direct, control, counteract, or awe the regular deliberation and action of the constituted authorities are destructive and have fatal tendency. So he says if you have some kind of association that's aimed at gaining political power and kind of obstructing the regular deliberation of our leaders, that's not good. He says these associations organize faction. They give it an artificial and extraordinary force. They put in the place of the delegated will of the nation the will of a party, often a small but artful and enterprising minority of the community. And according to the alternate triumphs of different parties, they make the public administration the mirror of the ill-concerted and incongruous projects of faction rather than the organ of consistent and wholesome plans digested by common councils and modified by mutual interests. Okay, so Washington says ideally we'll have a coherent, integrated public policy for the common good that's been discussed and deliberated and takes all interest into account. But he says when you have factions duking it out, sometimes you get a public policy that's not wholesome, that's not integrated. It just has, a little something in it for all these different factions, and when you put it all together, it doesn't make any sense. That's what Washington is trying to avoid. He says, however, combinations or associations may now and then answer popular ends. They are likely in the course and time and things to become potent engines. He says these parties, these factions, these associations, they take on a life of their own. They become engines, and we'll talk about this. We'll talk about the party machines that emerged in the late 1800s. He says, by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. So he says, I don't want ambitious and unprincipled men to hijack the political process. I want people who are interested in the common good and interested in discussion and deliberation and debate to come up with what's good for the people. But again, you have freedom, you're going to have factions, interest groups, political parties. Washington's own cabinet broke into the first two political parties. So we have the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury. They believed in a strong national government. Then we had a party called the Democratic Republicans, just to make it confusing. Today's Democrat and today's Republican Party both kind of claim to have originated in this Democratic Republican Party. It was led by Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State. And you can see the interests were regional. So Thomas Jefferson was from Virginia, and he represented the interests of the South, the more agricultural interests. Alexander Hamilton, he represented New York, and he was interested in the Treasury and Wall Street and the country's money supply, right? So they had kind of different views of the direction in which the new country should go. One of the big controversies was whether the federal government had power to create a national bank. Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, was all in favor of this national bank, and Thomas Jefferson said, hey, wait a minute. I've looked at the list of powers of Congress in Article 1, Section 8, and I do not see the power to create a national bank. I think that's too much power to New York and the financial districts, and it could be bad for our freedom. Okay, so they had a disagreement about this. By then, that list of powers in Article 1, Section 8 had already become a little squishy, a little subject to interpretation, right? You are probably familiar with the musical Hamilton, which is a lot of fun. If you click on this link here, or you can Google Hamilton cabinet battle, there's a portrayal of an argument in George Washington's cabinet between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, and it's portrayed as a rap battle. Okay, so they're having a rap battle over whether national bank would be appropriate public policy or not. So, to make up for the fact that I encouraged you to listen to the country western song by Johnny Horton on the Battle of New Orleans, you could also study, quote unquote, study by listening to Hamilton Cabinet Rap Battle #1. Okay, so the point is that we've had political parties ever since the beginning of our country. It's something to be expected. It's part of how the sausage gets made. So what happened to these two original parties? Spoiler alert, if you've watched the musical Hamilton or listened to the soundtrack, you know that Hamilton died in a duel. Okay, so he was shot by Aaron Burr, and the Federalist Party died out with him. And then after that, there was a period of time where the Thomas Jefferson Democratic Republican Party was basically the only game in town. Okay, it was called the era of good feelings because there wasn't the same degree of animosity and discussion and debate. Let's see, so you had Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. James Madison was part of Thomas Jefferson's party. James Monroe was part of Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party. And so this went on for a little while until the election of 1824. Andrew Jackson was one of the nominees for president at this time. Very popular guy. And you can see we have him on our $20 bill. Okay, you can't see the ginger hair in this picture. But you remember Andrew Jackson, war hero, pretty rough around the edges, but seen as a man of the people, kind of a political outsider. People loved him despite his cougar wife. So in the election of 1824, the election went to the Electoral College. They did things a little different back then. Lo and behold, Jackson did not win. John Quincy Adams won. Okay, there could not have been someone more different from Andrew Jackson. All right, so John Quincy Adams, he was the son of the second president, John Adams, and so already you get a little smack of the Adams dynasty. You can tell he's a Washington insider. He had worked in the administrations, worked in Congress. He was super well educated. He had gone to Europe. He was fluent in many languages. Very, very smart, cultured guy, but very different from Andrew Jackson. Okay, John Quincy Adams was definitely a cultured elite, a member of the establishment. He won the presidency, and Andrew Jackson was just outraged. Okay, so Jackson felt that the election had been stolen from him, and the people of the United States agreed. And so in 1828, Jackson won by a landslide. So as we discussed, the Federalist Party died out not long after Hamilton died in the duel. We had the Democratic Republican Party, but that split. Okay, so Jackson actually became the face of the new Democrat Party, the party of the people. And we'll talk more about the Tammany Society in just a minute. The opposing party was called the Whigs. So they only lasted for about 20 years. We had two Whig presidents in there. Both of them died in office, and their vice presidents became president. So that was not very auspicious. Okay, so there was this opposition party, the Whigs, that died out. Okay, and so the Democrat Party is the oldest political party in the United States, perhaps even in the world. Okay, so one of the ways that Jackson solidified his power and became president in 1828 was he cut a deal with this Tammany Society. Okay, so Tammany Society was a secret fraternal organization, kind of like the Masonic Lodge, the Masons, something like that. And they were Native American inspired. So today we probably call that cultural appropriation. They called their meeting hall a wigwam. They called their leader the Grand Sachem, right? So they had these, they probably had a secret handshake and all that. So very influential. Jackson went to the Tammany Society and he said, hey, will you help me get out the vote? Will you support me for president? If you endorse me, then when I get into power, I will remember you. And the Tammany Society thought that was a good deal. And so they agreed. Jackson became president, and he did remember the Tammany Society, and he gave them various political favors. And this system continued. The Tammany Society became very, very powerful, especially in New York politics. So we'll hear more about the Tammany Society later. All right. After the Whigs died out, you can see we're getting up to the Civil War. In the period before the Civil War, there were many sort of splinter political parties. Okay, the political parties were in chaos. They had not yet reorganized into the two main parties that we know today. So one of these splinter groups was called the Republican Party. Republican Party emerged in the 1850s from the anti-slavery movement. Okay, people are surprised by that today. Today, the Republican Party has a reputation for being anti-minority, but in fact, you reach down to the roots of the Republican Party. It was born out of the abolitionist movement, and Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president. He was known as the Great Emancipator. And there was a very important African-American political figure, former slave Frederick Douglass. He said things like, I am a Republican and I never intend to belong to any party other than the party of freedom. So the Republican Party was seen as the party of freedom, the party supporting the rights of Black Americans. The Republican-controlled Congress actually was responsible for passing the Reconstruction Amendments. We talked about these. The 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment, which mandated that the states must not discriminate, that they must treat their residents equally and provide them with due process equally. And then the 15th Amendment, which gave Black Americans the right to vote. All of the 20 or so Black members of Congress before 1900 were Republicans. And starting in the late 1800s, this will really blow your mind, the Republican Party also pushed for women's voting rights, and they were opposed by the Democrats. So the first woman in Congress actually was a Republican. If you're interested, you can click on this link here. This is a little 4-minute clip by Elbert Lee Guillory. Elbert Lee Guillory is an African-American politician in Louisiana, and he talks about reclaiming this heritage of the Republican Party. He used to be a Democrat. He made a switch to the Republican Party, and he gives a good explanation of why he did so. So again, you can even Google Elbert Lee Guillory, Why I Am a Republican. Very interesting speech, and he's trying to reclaim the history of the Republican Party as advocates for freedom and advocates for the Black community. Okay, so the country needed a little time to recover from the Civil War, and then in the late 1800s is a very interesting time. Between the Civil War and the Progressive Era, so again, those last couple decades of the 1800s, it's the era of political machines. You have something called political machines dominating elections. Remember, George Washington warned about this. He said that when you have factions that are looking out for partisan interests, very likely they will take on a life of their own, become engines, and that is what happened. And a good example of this was Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was a powerful machine based in New York. It dominated politics in New York City for about 70 years, from 1890 all the way through to 1960. So what happened is during the Industrial Revolution, there were it was a great place to find work. Okay, so America had all these factories in the big cities, and we were drawing immigrants from all over the place, especially Europe. So we had immigrants from Italy and Jewish immigrants and immigrants from Ireland. And these immigrants would arrive, for example, in New York City and other places, and they needed help getting adjusted. Okay, so they needed help finding a place to live, finding work, navigating the legal system. And so what Tammany Hall did, and also other political machines in other cities, is they provided social services for many new immigrants. So they would help people, these poor immigrants who were struggling, they would help them with their basic needs. But there were definitely strings attached. Okay, so the expectation was when election day came around, these immigrant families would vote for Tammany Hall politicians. And this was actually before the secret ballot. So what would happen is all these immigrants would line up at the time. The immigrant men would come line up, and the Tammany Hall politicians would give them pre-printed ballots. And, you know, it's unclear whether the immigrants even knew, you know, who was on the ballots or what was going on, but they would just drop these pre-printed ballots in the ballot box. So you can see this cartoon here. It's a cartoon by Thomas Nast. He's considered the father of American political cartoons. And you can see the big fat guy next to a ballot box. This is Boss Tweed. Okay, this is a caricature of Boss Tweed, kind of a funny name. He was one of the leaders of Tammany Hall. And he says, as long as I count the votes, what are you going to do about it? Say, in counting there is strength. So the point of this political cartoon by Thomas Nast is that Tammany Hall ran the ballot box, counted the votes. There was nothing you could do about it. And of course, the leaders of Tammany Hall ran this whole scam so they could get government jobs and contracts. Okay, it was very lucrative to be a leader in Tammany Hall, to be a Tammany Hall politician. You could get all kinds of government jobs, government contracts, and, you know, we'll talk about one example here. So I want to talk about a man named George Washington Plunkett. George Washington Plunkett was a machine politician. He worked for Tammany Hall. He did very well for himself. He didn't hide the fact that he himself held multiple positions in New York politics at a time, got very wealthy, but he worked for it. Okay, so this is a record, a day in the life of George Washington Plunkett. Thankfully, he kept a diary so we can get a good look at what his life was like. 2 a.m. Aroused from sleep by the ringing of his doorbell, went to the door and found a bartender who asked him to go to the police station and bail out a saloon keeper who had been arrested for violating the excise law, furnished bail, and returned to bed at 3 o'clock. Okay, so you get some sense for who Plunkett's constituents were, right? So he's good friends with the bartender, the saloon keeper. They were arrested. He got up in the middle of the night, went and helped them. 6 a.m. Awakened by fire engines passing his house. Hastened to the scene of the fire according to the custom of the Tammany district leaders to give assistance to the fire sufferers if needed. Okay, so he hears this fire engine. He runs to the scene of the fire. Met several of his election district captains who are always under orders to look out for fires, which are considered great vote getters. Okay, so if you can look out for a fire, help the people who have been burned out, then you are in the process of gaining votes for Tammany Hall. He found several tenants who had been burned out, took them to a hotel, supplied them with clothes, fed them, arranged temporary quarters for them until they could find a new apartment. So you can see very valuable social services, but also with strings attached. His day is only starting. 8:30 a.m. went to the police court to look out after his constituents, found 6 drunks, secured the discharge of 4 by talking to the judge, paid the fines of 2. So he's helping people out. 9 a.m. appeared in municipal district court, helped a widow who was about to be thrown out from her house, paid the rent of a poor family, gave them $1 for food. 11 a.m. He was back home, found 4 men waiting for him. They were looking for work, so George Washington Plunkett acted as an employment agency, helped find work for them. 3 p.m. attended the funeral of an Italian, hurried back to make his appearance at the funeral of a Hebrew constituent, went conspicuously to the front, both in the Catholic Church and the synagogue, and later attended the Hebrew confirmation ceremonies in the synagogue. So if there's a wedding or other celebration, you better bet George Washington Plunkett is going to be there and conspicuously up front. 7 p.m., this is where the real work happens. He went to district headquarters and presided over a meeting of election district captains. Each captain submitted a list of all the voters in his district, reported on their attitude toward Tammany, suggested who might be won over, how they could be won, who were in need, who were in trouble of any kind, the best way to reach them. A district leader took notes and gave orders. So this was before computers, okay? So these district captains had lists of the families in their neighborhood, and they wrote down all the needs, very personalized service, right? Wrote down all the needs that they were going to take care of in hopes of persuading them to vote for Tammany Hall. 8 p.m., went to a church fair, took chances on everything, bought ice cream for the young girls and the children, kissed the little ones, flattered their mother, took their fathers out for something down at the corner. Again, you see this pub or saloon culture here. 9 p.m. At the clubhouse again, spent $10 on tickets for a church excursion, etc., etc. 10:30 p.m. attended a Hebrew wedding reception and dance, had previously sent a handsome wedding present to the bride. So these rival machine politicians actually had spies in the department stores that would try to figure out what kind of gifts the other side was going to be giving at the upcoming weddings, and they would try to outdo each other with their wedding gifts using these department store spies. Okay, got very elaborate. And midnight, he's in bed. So you can see, George Washington Plunkett, very successful machine politician, but he definitely worked for what he got. So we get to the Progressive era, and many of the Progressive era reforms actually targeted the corruption of the machines. Remember, this is when women started getting more involved with politics. Women were not part of the saloon culture. That was a big oversight by Tammany Hall, and the female vote was seen as purer and less corrupt. So first we had direct primary elections. We'll talk more about primary elections next time. But in the past, what would happen is the Republicans would put up their candidate, the Democrats would put up their candidate, and basically each candidate had a 50-50 chance of making it into the slot. And so during the Progressive era, the feeling was that this gives way too much power to the political parties that's subject to corruption. What if the people had a voice? What if the people had a voice not just in who the ultimate candidate was, but who the candidate for each party was, who the party nominee was? So on a state-by-state basis, there was a movement to have primary elections. So giving the American people the chance to vote, not just for the ultimate slot, but also vote within the party for the party nominee. Direct primary elections gave the people a voice when selecting candidates within each party. This was not done by constitutional amendment. There's no nationwide system for primary elections. It's a state-by-state issue, and we'll talk more about that in future lectures. The direct election of senators. Remember, we talked about this, the fact that when the founders set up the Constitution, senators were chosen by state legislatures, and the idea was that senators were representing the states as states. So the progressives did not like this. They thought that state politicians were too corrupt, and they said, let's have the people elect senators directly as well. So you're kind of going around the, perceived corruption of the state level parties, state level legislatures, giving the people a voice in the direct election of senators and diluting the power of the political parties. Even prohibition. The prohibition of alcohol was in part an attack on the saloon culture of the machines. And we saw how much time George Washington Plunkett spent at the saloon, entertaining his constituents and bailing them out in court. The female vote was also seen as purer and less corrupt. So that was a major misstep by Tammany Hall, not to take into consideration the desires of the women. So we have an interesting story here that came during the Progressive era about a Republican president who went third party. This was Teddy Roosevelt. Okay, Teddy Roosevelt was a well-loved president. He was a progressive. He liked to get things done. You can see from the picture, he was an outdoorsman, a sportsman. He was very fit. He was very pro-exercise. Okay, very well-loved. So anyway, Teddy Roosevelt left office, and his successor was a guy named William Taft. William Taft was like the opposite of Teddy Roosevelt. Okay, so Taft was our heaviest president. Okay, so great big guy who was not very aggressive. Not, didn't do very much. Okay, so Taft didn't do all that much. He kind of sat around, and it frustrated Teddy, because Teddy Roosevelt was like, progressive presidents need to get stuff done. And so Roosevelt felt that, maybe he had retired from the presidency too early. So he went and talked to the Republican Party. And he said, I still have a lot of life left in me. I'm really sorry that I abdicated the presidency, right? I didn't run for re-election. I thought Taft would do a good job, but he's really not progressive enough. I want to run again. So Teddy said, and this was before there were term limits for presidents. So, presidents at that time could run as many times as the people would elect them. So Teddy says, don't put Taft up for re-election, put me up for re-election. And the Republican Party kind of had a conundrum, because, incumbents do have an advantage. We talked about this when we talked about Congress, the fact that if you're already in the presidency or already in a seat in Congress, it's easier to get reelected. Okay, it's traditional to put up the incumbent president for re-election, and kind of be a slap in the face to Taft if they didn't put him up for re-election. At the same time, Teddy Roosevelt, he was very well loved, and he would probably do well running for re-election himself. So they were in a conundrum. They decided to go traditional. They said, sorry, Teddy, we are going to nominate Taft for re-election. So Teddy actually created his own progressive party. He also called it the Bull Moose Party. So he was a hunter. He thought of the, strongest, hardiest animal he could come up with, the male moose, the bull moose. He said, I'm healthy as a bull moose. And he ran for election, actually kind of a re-election. It was a successful campaign for a third party, and he actually got more votes than Taft did. but there was a problem. What Teddy did is he split the Republican vote. Okay, so Teddy did get more votes than Taft, but he acted as a spoiler. He split the Republican vote, and actually the Democrat Party prevailed, and that is how we got Woodrow Wilson as president. So Teddy Roosevelt, cautionary tale for candidates who are tempted to run third party. Okay, this is one of the reasons why, for example, Bernie Sanders would not run third party, because he would split the Democrat vote, and then you could be assured that a Republican would win the presidency. Okay, so this is an example of why it's very difficult for a third party to break in, even somebody as popular as Teddy Roosevelt. So from the 1930s to the 1970s, the Democrats kind of dominated American politics, and one of the things that the Democrats did is they grew social welfare programs. For example, FDR's New Deal during the Great Depression, that gained a lot of popularity, especially for the poor and the marginalized. So the idea is that times are tough, but the government can come in and help soften some of the harsh edges of life. Then, of course, you had Lyndon Johnson and his Great Society with many different welfare entitlement programs. And again, these were very popular to people who were poor and marginalized. Democrats also received credit for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, passed during Johnson's presidency. So that was an interesting development. Actually, the Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower, was a champion of an earlier Civil Rights Act that it was just not the right time. That never got passed. It was floating around, actually filibustered and opposed by Democrats in the Senate, but eventually it was passed. It was signed by President Lyndon Johnson, and that solidified the Democrats' reputation as the party of the people, the party of minority rights, the party of civil rights. And during this time period, the power of political machines like Tammany Hall died down, because basically there wasn't a need for organizations like Tammany Hall to provide all of these social services. The government was doing it directly. Okay, so the government was providing different kinds of welfare and unemployment and other pensions and health subsidies. All of these things were being provided by the government directly, and especially by the Democrat Party, and there was no reason to continue these organizations, at least these official organizations like Tammany Hall. So starting in the 1980s and moving into the 1990s, there was kind of a conservative backlash. Okay, so up to that point, we had been traveling along this road, very progressive, having lots of different government programs that are starting to make our lives better. But then, led by President Ronald Reagan and others, Republicans started to argue that the federal government had become too big, too invasive, too expensive, too intrusive. Okay, so it was a very interesting time. This was also the time where communism was rising in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And there were stories kind of trickling out from behind the Iron Curtain that people in these countries were starving, also in East Asia, in North Korea and China, the idea that people didn't have enough food to eat, that political prisoners were being persecuted. And the question was, what is the end game of all these progressive programs? Because, we don't want to end up like these communist countries where the government owns everything and controls everything. It looks like that leads to shortages and, you know, uh, people getting jailed for being dissident and going against the government. There was a sense in which we wanted to define ourselves in opposition to communism, and we wanted to step back and reassess the role of government and say, should we be relying more on free markets? Should we be relying more on our own initiative and our own social networks rather than on the government? So we were reacting to the communist threat against freedom and prosperity and wondering what is the end game with all these government programs. Reagan and the conservative Republicans believed that less government is more, except for when it came to the traditional role of government like military defense. Okay, so Reagan was definitely all about building up our defense capabilities, and it ended up that this was a time of relative peace and prosperity. We did win the Cold War, and the Soviet threat was neutralized at that time. So it is a very interesting time period and a time for reflection about, what is the role of government and should we try to scale back some of our government programs. Reagan was a former actor from California. He was a very charismatic guy. He had some funny things to say. He said things like the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." That shows you what he thought about government help. And if you click on the photo I have in the PowerPoint, it's a link to one of his speeches where he says that as government expands, liberty contracts. So the idea is that the bigger and more powerful government is, the more we allow government programs and regulations to govern, everyday activities of our lives, the more we lose our freedoms. And Reagan was trying to recapture some of that affection for limited government that we have as a legacy from our founders. Okay, the conservative backlash did not last very long. Today, both Republicans and Democrats tend to support government programs, government bailouts. You can see even in the response to the coronavirus threat, what did Congress do? What did President Trump do? They passed a $2 trillion stimulus bill. Perhaps Republicans today are a little more reluctant to spend money and support government regulation than Democrats. But the federal government grew in size under both President George W. Bush and President Obama. The Democratic Party, since the time of Reagan, so for over my lifetime, over the last several decades, has become more and more progressive, including self-described democratic socialists. So we have people like Bernie Sanders, very popular in the Democrat Party, actually had his honeymoon in the former Soviet Union. Okay, so there's kind of a push toward democratic socialism, more government control, more government regulation and ownership. In the Republican Party, there's kind of been a split between more moderate establishment candidates and more right-wing and populist candidates. So now we have President Trump, who came in kind of as an outsider, very disruptive to politics as usual. So we're going to have to see how this all shakes out. So I'd like you to pick a political issue that you find important. So maybe it's abortion or gun control or gun rights, or maybe it's immigration. And Think about, do you know the Republican and Democratic platforms on your issue? And think about whether you agree or disagree with those platforms. As we'll see, Republicans and Democrats have very different platforms on these issues that are polarizing American society today. So if you take the issue of abortion, Democrats are generally pro-choice, Republicans are generally pro-life. If you take the issue of immigration, many Democrats believe in open borders, many Republicans believe in building a wall. Okay, take any issue. If you take the issue of taxation, many Republicans believe that taxes should be cut. Many Democrats believe that taxes should be raised, at least on the rich. So on and on down the line, it's really quite amazing the differences that we have in these party platforms. So individuals, individual voters, individual politicians may have different views. Okay, so you may agree with the Republicans on some things and agree with the Democrats on other things. But this is very difficult for politicians because remember, there's a lot of pressure to stick with the party line. So we're going to take a look at the Democrat and Republican platforms a little bit. The Democrat platform emphasizes the need for government intervention and social justice. So we'll talk about that. If you click on this link here, you'll get a link to the Democrat platform. I encourage you to do that, okay? So don't just take my word for what the Democrats are talking about. You can actually go and explore their website and see for yourself the items on their platform. Here at the bottom, you may recognize this style of cartoon. This is Thomas Nast again, the father of the American political cartoon. He's the one that popularized the image of the donkey for the Democrat Party. Actually, up until, about the 2016 election, the Democrats had a little donkey in their logo. They were kind of proud of that designation, but then they rebranded, and now they just have this very boring D inside of a circle, right? But the donkey is considered a traditional symbol of the Democrat Party. So what's important to Democrats? They talk a lot about security, economic security for the middle class. What does this mean? This means government protection, government subsidies for workers, for housing, for education, for health care. Again, the emphasis on the need for government programs to provide security for the population. They also emphasize what they call fairness. They would like to see more taxes, higher taxes for the wealthy, more regulation of Wall Street, more regulation of corporations to bring that in line with what they believe is fair. So the Democrats talk a lot about income inequality and programs to redistribute wealth and reduce income inequality. Democrats also talk quite a bit about social justice. So they have programs to combat climate change, to fix immigration, to guarantee the rights of minorities, women, and members of the LGBTQ community. I have a clip here from Prager University you might be interested in. You can click on that link in the PowerPoint. And it's a story of a young black woman talking about her political beliefs and how she was a Democrat in college, what that meant, and how she ultimately decided to change parties and some of that thought process when she decided to become Republican, and even some of the names that she got called, racist, misogynist, sexist, etc., for abandoning the Democrat Party. So, this is very interesting. That the stereotype is that Democrats are the ones that are more concerned about the poor, more concerned with the rights of minorities, with the rights of women, etc. Actually, I think I got my links wrong. This is the link to the young woman speaking about her transition from the Democrat Party to the Republican Party. The link on the previous slide actually was the opposite. So that's a clip from Charlie Crist from Florida. He's a politician from Florida, and he's discussing why he switched party affiliations the opposite direction from Republican to Democrat. The reporter Jorge Ramos is grilling him a little bit about the timing of his switch, but Charlie Crist basically says that he switched parties because he wanted to be with the party that's seen as affiliated with women and minorities and economic fairness, etc. So the link on this page would be a response to that, why a young black woman would consider becoming a Republican. So it's very interesting, the discourse that we have these days between Democrats and Republicans. Again, very highly polarized. You'll see here the elephant, again, popularized by Thomas Nast as a symbol for the Republican Party. Republican Party is also called the GOP, stands for Grand Old Party. That's kind of a nickname. They rebranded their logo recently as well, but you can see they still have a teeny tiny little elephant in their logo. So with respect to the economy, Republicans generally, and again, there's gradients involved here, but in general, conservative Republicans like to talk about reducing taxation and regulation. They embrace the traditional role of government, which is defense, so they're in favor of strong military, secure borders, and traditional values. So in general, Republicans, or the official Republican platform, is more amenable to traditional values such as the importance of families, the importance of traditional marriage, and the sanctity of unborn life. Nonetheless, even though Republicans talk about reducing taxation, reducing regulation, it's very difficult to reduce government spending. Very politically difficult to cut entrenched subsidies and entitlement programs. No politician is going to run on a platform of cutting Medicare, Medicaid, or cutting Social Security, even though we've seen those programs eat up a vast majority of our federal budget, but very politically difficult to cut back on those things. So most Republicans don't even try. Speaking broadly, Democrats and at least the more conservative Republicans tend to view freedom and equality differently. So Democrats emphasize positive freedom. This is the government help me freedom, the idea that bigger government promotes important social goals and that you're not really free unless the government is helping you reach your potential, helping cushion some of the hard edges of life. The Republican Party tends to emphasize more negative freedom, government leave me alone, how smaller government might protect individual choice and individual responsibility and encourage free market solutions. Democrats, again, tend to emphasize equal opportunity in the form of the government actively promoting the rights of disadvantaged groups, the government taking victim status and intersectionality into account in its policies. Republicans tending to emphasize more equal dignity, protecting all parties equally, so that would be equality under the law where the government doesn't look at what group you might be from, including the unborn and including those who hold traditional religious beliefs. So you can see how the parties fall along our rubric here, these definitions, competing definitions of freedom and equality. And you can see that the Republican Party tends to be more in sympathy with the vision of the founders, the limited government of the founders, although of course there's really no way to go back to the very limited government of the founders. But you can see that the Republican Party platform tends to be more in sympathy with that vision. I'm going to leave you with something to think about, a thought question for the next lecture. We talk about the different visions of freedom and equality. I'd like to think for a little bit about sexual freedom, sexual liberation. Should we call it a positive or a negative freedom? This is a question that comes up that if Republicans are in favor of government leaving us alone, less regulation, less government involvement, then why do they care about traditional sexual values? Why do they care about prohibiting abortion or promoting traditional families? Shouldn't the government just leave us alone in those areas of our life as well? So that's kind of a interesting, point of incongruence that I'd like to talk about a little bit. What does sexual freedom mean? And when the government regulates our sexual freedom, what does that mean as well? So just a little teaser for the next lecture. All right, thanks for bearing with me, and we'll see you next time.